First thing I want to do is just set up the interface to make life a little bit easier, and that just really involves enabling a couple of add-ons and changing a couple of settings. And to do that, I'm going to come up to Edit and Preferences. And the first tab here is the Interface tab, and in here the resolution scale. Left click and drag, you can see it increases the size of the text on screen. So I'm just going to click in here and just put in a value of 1.3. Makes it easier to read the text and to follow along the recording. So the next one down here is add-ons. So what we need to do then is just enable a couple of these. So I'm just going to grab this little slider and just drag down towards the bottom here. And the first one here is going to be the Loop Tools add-on, and that just enables a couple of features when we're working in edit mode. You can click the drop down here and click documentation if you want to have a read of the different features available here. Scroll down a little bit further, and this one here to Node Wrangler. This one is very useful when we're working in the Node editor. It can speed up your workflow and has some nice additional features it adds within the Node editor. Okay, and that's more or less it for the add-ons. The next tab I'm going to come down to is the Input tab. And I'd recommend using a 3-button mouse, but if you don't have a 3-button mouse, you can enable this option here, Emulate 3-button mouse. That way you can use the Alt key in conjunction with the left mouse button. So check that if you only have a 2-button mouse. The next tab then is the Navigation tab. So I'm going to enable Orbit Around Selection and come down here to Zoom to Mouse Position. That way you can just zoom into the position of the cursor on screen. Okay, with that done, I'm going to come over and just click this button here. And you can see I have auto save preferences on. So it's going to save the preferences automatically. So I'm going to close this down. Okay, and that was just setting up a couple of add-ons and changing some preferences. And that's going to do it for this one. Let's take a look at navigating in Blender. And the first thing really to look at is the mouse and how you can navigate with that. If I press and hold the middle mouse button, I can rotate around the 3D view here. If I press and hold Control and the middle mouse button, I can zoom in and out. And if I press and hold Shift and the middle mouse button, I can pan the view. Now that's similar to the controls up here. So if I hover the mouse in this circle here and left click and drag, I can rotate around in the 3D view. Also, if I click the plus here and drag, I can zoom in and out. And also the hand button here allows me to pan the view. So similar to the controls you have with the mouse, you can access those with these 3 widgets up here. The next icon here is the camera icon, and that brings me in and out of camera view. So if I click this here, this brings me into current camera view. Okay, and I can click it again and that brings me out. So you can see that this object here is the camera. When I have it selected, you can see it over here in the outliner, and that's the view you get when you click this camera button here. Okay, so I can press G when I'm in the view and move the camera around if I want to. I can left click. So I'm just going to come back out of camera view. The next one then is to switch between the perspective and orthographic views. So if you take a look on the top left over here, we're currently in the user perspective view. If I click this here, I can switch to a user orthographic. So if I press the apostrophe key, it brings up the view pie menu. That allows me to pick any of these views. So for example, I can come into a top view. Now I need to zoom out here so I can see where this cube is. Again, if I press the apostrophe key and press front, brings me into a front view. And you'll notice I'm still in an orthographic view. If I come over here and switch to perspective and I'll press the apostrophe key, I'm going to come into a top view. It automatically brings me into an orthographic, so I can switch between perspective and ortho then. So again, if I press the apostrophe key and come to left, it's bringing me from a perspective to an orthographic. Another way to switch views is through this widget here. So for example, if I click the positive Y, you can see it switches me into a back orthographic view. Okay, so if I click the top Z, it's going to bring me into a top orthographic. Now if I hover the mouse on these, you can see that it's telling me the shortcut is Control Numpad 1. So that's kind of a nice useful feature. You can quickly learn what shortcuts will bring you into the different views. So you can either use this icon up here, or like I said, you can use the apostrophe key and just quickly switch between the different views. You also have the ability to switch into the camera view here. So I'm just going to right click. I can press and hold the middle mouse button just to come back around here. Okay, and that's just a quick intro to navigating the scene in Blender. Look at collections in Blender. And in 2.8 they replaced the old layer system and groups that used to be available in 2.7. Now collections are important because of the fact that they do replace layers, and they're very important in scene organization. So it's important to understand their function within your scene. So by default, we get this little eye icon here, and that allows us to switch on and off the visibility of objects within a collection or the entire collection. So if I switch off the visibility of the camera, you can see that hides that camera in the scene. So if I come up here to this drop-down menu here, I can switch on some other functionality that's available within collections. So I can switch on the ability to select an object within the scene. I can also switch on the ability to disable objects within the viewport, and I can switch on this icon here that allows me to have an object render or not in final output. So I'm just going to minimize this. So the first icon then is this little arrow icon, and if I select it and if I switch it off, you can see that all the objects within that collection then darken down, and that just indicates that they're unselectable now within the 3D view. Okay, and that can be very useful if you don't want to accidentally move an object. So I'm going to unselect this. You can also individually make objects unselectable within that collection. The next one then is what we looked at originally, and that's just the temporary visibility of objects in the viewport. So the next icon then allows you to just globally disable objects within the viewport. And then finally is the render icon. So you can disable the ability for an object to render within the viewport. So let's take a look then at what we can do with collections. So I'm just going to rename this to C_cubes, press enter. So I want to move my camera and my light object out of this collection and into its own collection. First thing I could do is right click here and maybe add a new collection. So I can click new collection, can double click and just maybe rename this to C_cameras, press enter. And if I select the camera in the viewport here, I can press M, and that brings up the move to collection menu, and I can choose C_cameras that I just created over here. Okay, and that moves that camera then into that collection. And a little icon appears then beside the camera to indicate that there's a camera in this collection. So if I minimize the collection and drag this out a little bit, you can see that little icon appears here, and can be very useful to just get a visual of what's in your collection. So for example, if I press Shift A and I add another camera, you can see now a number appears and it increases to 2. You'll also notice that because I had this camera collection selected, that new camera automatically gets added to the selected collection. So it's going to minimize this. So for example, if I click the cubes collection and I press Shift A and I add another cube, that gets added to the selected collection. And that's kind of important. It's not obvious that that's going to happen. And sometimes you can find objects getting added to collections you didn't mean them to be added to. So that's just one to watch out for. Okay, so I'm going to select the light here and I'm going to press M. The move to collection menu also gives me the ability to add a new collection. So I'm going to click new collection. I'm going to call this C_lights, press enter and click OK. Now you can see a new collection is added over here and my light gets added to it. So I'll just minimize the lights. So within collections, you can also select them and drag them inside of other collections. So if I drag this over the cubes collection, my light collection now is nested inside of the cubes collection. So if I want to bring this back to its own collection, I can select it, drop it over scene collection, and now you can see that C lights is its own collection again. Okay, so one other thing I can do with collections, so I'm just going to select the cubes collection. I'm going to select this cube here, maybe just press G, drag it out of the way, maybe select the second one that I added. I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to come down here to collection instance and choose cubes. And now that collection gets added to the scene. So if I press G, I can drag this away. So if I select this cube here and tab into edit mode, you can see the instance of that object also gets selected and I can edit it. So if I select face here, I can press I to inset and maybe E to extrude, and you can see that that affects that instance object, which is a nice, fast, easy way of modeling objects within Blender. Okay, so I'm going to tab back to object mode and maybe just select the instance and delete. Okay, and that's just a quick introduction to collections. Before we get started, and the first one is if I come over to the scene tab here and take a look at the units. Now in Blender 2.8 by default the unit system is set to metric, and that's going to be fine. Okay, it's going to unit scale of 1. I'm going to be happy with that. and the length is going to be displayed in meters. So let's just take a look at this. So I'm going to press A and select everything and just press delete. I'm also going to come up to the collections here and just select them and just delete these two, and maybe just leave cameras for the moment. So I'm going to press numpad 1. You can also press the apostrophe key and choose front view. I'm also in a front orthographic, toggle between perspective and ortho with the 5 key, or you can come up here and just use this little button here. Okay, so I'm just going to pan this over. I'll press Shift A for the add menu and add a cube. You can also use the add menu up here, select this mesh and choose a cube. So I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. And the first thing I'd like to look at is the snapping. So up here you'll notice a magnet icon. So it's called snap during transform. It's currently set to off. I'm just going to switch it on. You can see that highlights this little button. And beside that then is a drop down menu that has the different snapping types. By default it's set to increment. So let's take a look at that. So if I press G to move the object and I press Z to restrict it to the Z axis, you can see that it snaps in little increments. So if you look up on the left hand side, it's snapping at 0.1 of a meter each time I move, and that's represented by the small grid divisions. So I'm just going to right click and I'm going to press N just to bring up the sidebar, and if I just come over to the item, we can have a look then and see that the dimensions are 2 by 2 by 2. That is, it's 2 meters in the X, Y and Z. And if we take a look at the grid division, you can see that one grid division then is equal to 1 meter. So if I just come over to the units again, and I'm going to switch this from meters to millimeters. And now if I press G and Z and snap this up along, you can see it's been displayed then on the top left at 100 millimeters each time I move along here. And it's probably a little bit easier to quickly read when it's set to mil. So I'm just going to left click with that there. Now if I zoom in a little bit, actually I'm going to zoom right in here into the smaller grid divisions, and I press G, Z, and now you'll notice up top left it's snapping to 1 millimeter each time I move up along. Okay, so I'm going to right click and just zoom out. So as you zoom in, you get the smaller and smaller grid division movements. So you can accurately place an object within the scene using the snap. The other option for snapping is to switch it off, and I'll switch the type then to vertex. Now if I press Shift D to make a copy of this cube, I can press X just to restrict it to the X axis. I can left click. I'm going to tab into edit mode. Actually what I might do is just press and hold the middle mouse button and just come around here. I'm going to switch this to vertex up here with this little icon here. You can also press 1 on your keyboard to switch to vertex. I'm going to select this vert here, press G. Now to activate the snap when it's set to off, you just press and hold Control, and now you can see I can snap to vertices once you place the cursor over them. Okay, so that's a good way of accurately snapping an object. You can also snap it to other objects in the scene. Just going to right click and just come back up to snap for a second and switch this to face. So if I set my selection to face selection, I can select this face here. I can press G, X to restrict it to the X axis, and I can snap then to any face. So I'm just going to right click, actually rotate around, press G, X, and just snap it then to the face of the other object here. Okay, so I'm just going to right click to cancel that, and I'll tab back to object mode. Okay, so I'm just going to delete that cube, and that's snapping, and we'll be using it throughout the course, but I just wanted to introduce that to people who are unfamiliar with it. So there's one more thing I want to quickly look at, and that's the origin point of an object. So again, I'm just going to press 1 to come into front view, and I'm just going to pan this up here. Select this object, and you can see at the center of the object we have a small little orange dot that represents the origin of that object. We take a look over on the sidebar here and the object's transformation. You can see that in the Z axis it's at position 1000 meters. Okay, and you can see, and we look at the grid there, I can left click and drag in here, and I can drag this back and maybe place it back at 0. So I'm just going to click in here and put it at 0, and you can see that the origin point of the object is what's represented up here on its position for the X, Y and Z. Okay, so that's an important point to remember. You'll also notice if I press G and move this object that the origin point comes along with it. Okay, so if I place it out here, the origin point comes with it. I'm going to press Alt G to clear out the location. That brings my X, Y and Z back to 0. I'm going to press Tab now and just come into edit mode. You can also switch the modes up here with this drop down menu. We'll mostly be using edit and object, so I'm going to have it set to edit. I'm going to come up here to snapping and just set this back to increment. I'm going to press A to select all of this object. I'm going to press G and Z just to snap it up along here. I'm going to press and hold Control to snap it actually, and left click. Now you can see this time that the origin point of the object has remained exactly where it is. And that's an important point. So again, if I press G and just move this over here, the origin point of that object remains in place. And that's an important point to remember, that when you move an object in edit mode, its origin point will remain in place. So if I tab back to object mode, while in object mode I move an object, the origin point moves along with it. So if I press R to rotate this object, you can see that it rotates around its origin point. Okay, so I can right click. Now it's possible to manually pick the origin point of an object. So for example, one method is if I tab into edit mode, I'm going to switch to vertex. I can select this vert maybe here on the corner, press Shift S to bring up my snap menu. I'm going to choose cursor to select it, and that places the cursor then at that vertex. I'm going to tab back to object mode, and up here in the object menu I can click this and I can set the origin then to 3D cursor. I could also set it to the geometry, and actually let's do the geometry first, and that places it back in the center of that object. So I can also, like I said, set it to the 3D cursor. So if I come up to object, set origin, and I can choose 3D cursor. Okay, and that places then the origin point of the object at the 3D cursor. And if I rotate that object, then it's going to rotate around the origin point. So I'm just going to right click. It's also useful for just snapping it into position. So for example, if I press Shift S and I put the cursor to the world origin, I can now just press Shift S and selection to cursor, maybe keep offset. Okay, and that places the object back at the 3D cursor. So that's just one thing to look out for when you're editing an object and you find that your origin point has moved. You just need to be aware that you can actually reposition the origin point for that object quite easily. Okay, so that was just a quick look at units in Blender, snapping using the increment and vertex, and the origin point, and how you can manipulate it using the 3D cursor and how it differs in object and edit mode. Okay, but otherwise I'm going to leave it there for this one.